Okay. Thank you all for coming to Global to Local, a critical conversation on international aid in a changing world. My name is Melly Slater. I'm the Outreach and Communications Manager at Soft Landing Missoula. Normally, Mary would be standing here tonight, but unfortunately, she's homesick with a 100-degree fever, so you get me instead. If you're not familiar with Soft Landing, we're a local nonprofit that serves refugees and immigrants in Missoula. We partner with our community to provide supportive services and welcome for refugees, immigrants in Missoula, working together to create a home where new neighbors can integrate and thrive. Okay, maybe I'll stand this way. We've done spring lecture series like this in the past, and last fall when we were talking about what the topic should be, we thought international aid would be a fun and interesting topic. Now the subject has evolved much more in the last 6 months, so tonight will be very informative. Tonight's event wouldn't be possible without Gillian Gales, our champion that helps us put together events like this. We would also like to thank tonight's co-sponsors, the Frank Global Leadership Initiative, Davidson's Honors College, the School of Public Health and Community Health Sciences, International Development Studies, and Migration Studies, as well as MCAT, who will be recording this evening. So if you have anyone at home who couldn't make it, we'll be able to share this evening's recording. Tonight's event will be broken down into 2 sections. We'll start with an overview of international aid with Dr. Paul Lauren, and then that will be followed by a panel discussion and moderated Q&A with Dr. Rose Zolliger. In your program, which I hopefully you got at the door on your way in, you'll find information about all our wonderful panelists. Feel free to read their bios while you wait. We'll be taking questions via note card this evening. If you didn't get one at the door, please raise your hand and we'll have Allie and Giselle walk around and pass out note cards to you. For tonight's Q&A, we're hoping to have a robust and honest conversation around a complex topic. Our panelists welcome all questions, and we know the folks in this room will be thoughtful, respectful, and concise when asking them. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Paul Lauren. He's a Regents Professor Emeritus and Distinguished Mansfield Fellow. He's widely recognized as a leading teacher and scholar of international relations, diplomacy, and human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Can you hear me all right? Right, up. Can you hear me all right? All right, good, thanks. Thanks for coming tonight. I want to be clear that when you're a speaker, I have yet to have anybody invite me to speak and they say, Paul, you can talk about anything you want to talk about. You're always given an assignment. And so I have an assignment tonight, and I want to make it clear what that assignment is. My assignment is to place the question of international aid in context, in a historical context, in a broad international context, and that's exactly what I'd like to do. My comments are based upon spending a great deal of time in the subject area, lecturing around the world, sometimes to nice places, sometimes to very, very nasty places that required an armed bodyguard from the Diplomatic Security Service. And I'll try to bring some of these perspectives into this conversation this evening. But before I begin, I'd like to make several points about the lecture title that you see. So this would be some of the major themes that you can expect. One is that international aid always involves an interaction between the local and the global, and the global and the local. So this is a constant theme that we're going to be discussing this evening. In addition, it says a critical conversation. In my mind, that means an honest conversation and an honest discussion about the state of affairs. In addition, international aid is conducted by governments for a variety of different motives. And these different motives require different tools or different forms, and I'll discuss some of those. In addition, the theme talks about a changing world. As a historian, I study change through time and history. And I say this with particular reference to the rest of you in this audience with gray hair. The older that any of us get, I think we appreciate the changes that we've seen in our own lifetime. And I must admit, speaking very personally, that I'm seeing changes in Montana that I never thought I'd live to see. I'm seeing changes in my own country that I never thought I'd live to see. And I'm living and watching changes in the world internationally that I never thought I'd live to see. History is always about change. And history for a nation is like memory for a person. We need a memory to tell us what works and what doesn't work. It helps to propel us from the present into the future. And so all of the cases that I'm going to be talking about tonight about how international aid has evolved, people are always asking, what can I do? How meaningful is this to me for the future? So although I'm going to be talking initially about the past, history, it's all directed to the future. And all of this presentation will be directed to the future of our other panelists, right? Finally, I've assembled some illustrations for this presentation for two reasons. One, I think that years of teaching have convinced me that some people just plain learn better by looking at images, and I'm sympathetic to that. The other reason, and perhaps even more importantly, is as these images come up, I want to remind you that international aid is about people. And it's important to get real about real people. So having said all this, I'd like to begin with really a discussion about the history of foreign aid. I mean, fundamentally, what we now call foreign aid, in my mind, begins with missionaries. And it begins, you can't have a concept of foreign aid unless you have a concept of the globe. We all live in a locale, but the concept of something beyond yourself fundamentally is a function of communication. You need to know what's happening abroad. And also transportation. Can you transport people or goods or services from one part to another? These are people who took their faith seriously about clothing the naked, feeding the hungry, healing the sick. And I mention this particularly for those of you who happen to be interested in foreign aid and relief and do so out of a context of religious faith. There's a long tradition for this. If we were in Geneva, I would take you down the path from the old city, and there'd be a bust of a man about this big, and it would be this man, Henri Dunant. Middle of the 19th century, he was absolutely horrified about the destruction wreaked by modern warfare. This is in the 19th century, both on soldiers and on civilians. And like all of us, said at one time or the other, what can I do? And it'd be so easy to simply throw up your hands and say, there's nothing I can do. He was motivated strongly because of his faith, and he decided to do something about it and create an organization called the International Committee of the Red Cross, with all that that meant in terms of providing services, providing health care, and so on. And since we're speaking of the 19th century, I can't help but indicate that around 1886, the United States received a gift from France, Statue of Liberty. It was a time when America welcomed immigrants, a time when they welcomed refugees. And if you ever go to visit this monument, you'll see a plaque at the base, and the plaque reads this. It's important to be reminded of this. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free the wretched refuge of your teeming shore. Send these the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. And I can't help but comment that as I look around the audience, unless you're Native American, all of us, including me, are the descendants of immigrants or refugees that came to this country. Right? One of the major reasons why international aid has become such an important matter is the level of destruction that has happened one time or the other. And in 1914, the First World War broke out. When this broke out, the German army invaded Belgium, northern part of France. And of course, people who were stuck on the ground who didn't know that this war was coming, you can hardly grow crops, you can hardly harvest them, and people began to starve. And in response to this, starving people in Belgium, it prompted a growing concern about people saying, what can we do in this situation? And through a collective body of volunteers, some government diplomats, some banks, some commercial firms, some transportation companies, set out an appeal to help the Belgians, one in this case to provide food, in another case to provide garments, clothing for people, and find a way to ship this to northern France and to Belgium. This did not involve governments in any significant way, but it involved a great deal of cooperative effort. It's an ad hoc arrangement, and the purpose fundamentally is humanitarian, to try to take care of those people caught up in war. And no one had planned this in advance. The war happened and they had to respond. Another response at exactly the same time, and people are motivated by different things. One might be starvation, one might be destitution of one kind or another. There was a woman by the name of Eglantine Jubb. You've got to love this 19th century female name, aren't you? Eglantine. Eglantine Jubb was a school teacher, also motivated by her religious beliefs, who had a particular heart for children. She was concerned about those children during the course of the First World War who were being starving, who were pushed aside, become refugees. And she decided, rather than just throw up her hands, to create an organization, and that organization was Save the Children, right, which still exists to this day. At the end of the war, the devastation was profound. And we're talking about a situation in which there's the First World War, there's a revolution in Russia, and there's a rapidly changing borders in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe. So in the middle of this chaos, there are thousands of people who are dying, who are refugees and forced relocation. And so in response to this, the scale is such that private organizations and private NGOs and charities simply cannot cope with the scale. And they need governments to become involved. And the response was to create the League of Nations in the 1920s and the 30s in order to respond to these humanitarian kind of issues. And so in a way that we very frequently forget, there were dramatic new departures on the part of the League of Nations in terms of dealing with women, with children, with indigenous peoples, with racial minorities, right? In education, in health, right? All began to be new efforts on the part of the League of Nations to address questions of international aid, right? At the same time, they created something also very new called the Refugee Organization. And that is, as refugees flooded into Western Europe, flooded through Istanbul or Constantinople, right? They had no place to go. They're fleeing for their lives. They're fleeing with their kids, and we've seen these scenes today. They don't have passports because they didn't plan on taking a vacation. They didn't go to their government and say, we need a passport. that government has failed them. That government is trying to exclude them. And so the League came up with something very creative called the Nansen Passport, in which the League provided some kind of, and you can see this, certificate of identity and travel, transportation, in order to assist them in evacuating, trying to reconnect families, parents and children, trying to find homes, trying to find jobs. If that sounds somewhat familiar with Soft Landing, it should. This is where this begins, right? And it's important to understand that governments have to be involved in this. It's also important to understand that the United States refused to be involved. It deliberately refused to be involved in the League, and at times actually tried to subvert some of its actions. Because operating under the explicit expression, and this may sound familiar, America first, right? The U.S. said, we don't need anyone else. We can do anything we want in the world. We're not connected. The global is not connected with the local. And through a result of this policy, a number of tariffs, the U.S. not only did not contribute to these efforts, it also contributed to the outbreak of the Second World War. When that war was over, the devastation in Europe, in Asia, from bombing, the devastation from Holocaust, the devastation from the introduction of atomic weapons, not only sunk American isolationism, but it persuaded Americans that they couldn't be isolated from the world. The Second World War, like no other war, convinced many Americans that the idea of somehow not being a part of the international regime was sheer disaster. And as a result of this, there was a clear understanding that, and it's important that you understand this connection, if you want security, you need peace. And if you want peace, you have to have justice. And if you want justice, you have to respect human rights. All four of those elements are important. And so, in 1945, celebrating the end of the war, Americans and others decided what we're going to do is create the United Nations. The understanding from the experience, and this is, I come back to the human experience that we all have. We live through times in which we're apart. The Second World War, remember, is the second World War in the span of one generation, right? And that's important to remember. They're convinced that what happens locally in a given country can have enormous global implications. And obviously, because of the war, what happens in the globe can have enormous local implications. And the implications, whether they're local or whether they're global, all have to do with people, real people. So with that in mind, it's not just a coincidence that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was created in 1948. Eleanor Roosevelt coordinated as chairperson of this committee this powerful text of human rights. And so the UN began, following in the wake of the pattern set by the League of Nations, began to create organizations to address particular problems. And all of those problems had to do with people. So, for example, for starving kids, the creation was UNICEF, which is still in existence. In response to the flood of still more refugees, now from the Second World War, the response was the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, right? headquarters now in Geneva. In response to questions of hunger, the answer was the United Nations World Food Program. In response to questions of illness, immunizations, and we're going to hear more about that, Rose, from you and others, the response is the World Health Organization. Right? All of these, I don't need to tell you, have recently been in the news. Right? At the same time that the UN is created and that the Universal Declaration rights are enunciated, there's another development. And that development happens to be the Cold War. Right? People thought that after they fought the Second World War, had sacrificed at least 50 million lives, right? That would be the end of conflict. It was not. The wartime allies decided to not cooperate in peace, but rather engage in international competition. And so beginning, really, I would argue, shortly after the Second World War, the United States finds itself as an extreme adversary of Soviet Union, and then after 1949 with China. And there is an international conflict about stopping communism. And this too, to come back to one of the central themes of this evening, involves an interaction between global and local, right? The global conflict certainly had local implications in terms of the Red Scare, right? Here in Montana and here in Missoula, I might add, right? It's this connection about you can't divorce yourself from global affairs or from national affairs. So the question, and you can understand this, it seems to me, is the United States is actively participating in these UN programs that I've just mentioned, right? But all of a sudden, the Cold War is happening at the same time. And so the question for policymakers would obviously be, look, if we're going to engage in international aid, which is the subject of this evening, right, what is the best way to do that? Should we, for example, decide that we're going to cooperate with the United Nations? We have in the past. We want to continue this. We want to pool our resources with other governments to provide the kind of assistance that is needed. All right. The other argument is, no, in the time of a Cold War, we want to control our foreign aid. We want to control the monetary features of this. We want to control where it goes. And quite frankly, we want to get credit for it. We don't want to just merge our funds in with everybody else. And so the question is, do you participate in multilateral aid programs, or do you go it alone? Or do you have some combination? So this brings us to the question of how to do it. The United States decided, and this is where we really began to enter foreign aid business, is the Marshall Plan in Europe. That is to provide considerable assistance to Western Europe. And what's important for our discussion tonight about the Marshall Plan is that it revealed two different motives. One of those motives was humanitarian, and the other is we don't want Western Europe to fall to communism, and we want to support it so that they become anti-communist. Right? Now, this raises the important question that we really need to consider. Because public funds are obviously used for American aid and the aid of other countries, it's a very legitimate question to ask, why? Why are we doing this, right? Why should we spend money or give things to other countries when we have our own problems at home? A legitimate question. So what I want to suggest is that there are 4 explanations about motives. One of these is humanitarian. That is, Americans who say, look, I have compassion for people who are forced out of their country. I have empathy for those who are starving, those who are dying because of sickness, those who are suffering because of natural disasters. And I just want to take care of them. It's the right thing to do. We're a wealthy nation, we can afford to do it, and consequently, we ought to simply do it. And here's an important point about that. We don't expect anything in return. Right? For people who are engaged, whether it's locally or internationally, people who have a humanitarian motive are not interested in how is that going to help me? And so humanitarian aid is one of the explanations. Another explanation has to do with what I want to call general global world stability. That is, it just makes sense to support democratic governments. It makes sense to prevent diseases and pandemics from happening. It makes sense to just have friends and set a good example in the world. And if you believe in the relationship between security, peace, justice, and human rights, supporting human rights leads to stability in the world. That's good for Americans, and it's good for the rest of the world. Huh? A third motive has to do with supporting aid because it's going to do something for us. It may open markets for our products and deny them to others, right? It may provide Montana farmers with income who are selling the grain, right? Pharmaceutical companies in America, defense contractors in America. This money isn't just sent overseas, it's spent on American jobs and American industries and farmers here in the United States. Leveraging our foreign aid helps us find friends and helps us know that as a result, we need to support this, not the least of which is if we support stability, it means that stability in a country means that that country isn't going to go into chaos, listen to me carefully here, and have people who want to leave that country and come to the United States as refugees. It's just in our interest. We're going to give aid and we want something to do it. Similarly, there are those who support the idea of military aid, saying we're going to leverage military aid because we want access to oil, we want access to raw materials, we want to create allies, we want bases that will allow us to have launching places to confront our adversaries, and so on. And the answer is, you bet we want something for our foreign aid. So the point I'm trying to make is that it's complex, and as a result, we need to be very clear about the fact that there are mixed motives. So it means that there is such a thing called hard power, that is American support of military aid. It can be done for a variety of things. As I speak, some of that aid is going to one country for deterrence, to keep a country from attacking it. American military aid is going to another country that currently is at war, and we're helping to defend it. In another case, American military aid is aiding a country to engage in aggression and genocide. But hard power isn't the only power, because there's something called soft power. And there are other things, tools that are used by Americans in foreign aid. In 1961, 2 things happened. One, the Peace Corps was created. I know that a number of you in this audience, including you, Chris, were veterans of the Peace Corps, and you may want to talk about that. In 1961, USAID was created. Also very much in the news. You can see, and the figures change from month to month, but to give you some idea of where that aid is going, Ukraine has received the most. But USAID has a variety of forms of aid. Some is development aid in terms of education, for democracy, for the development of civil society, for women, for children, for economic development, some for the creation of jobs and new markets, some for very practical questions on the ground of agriculture, some for healthcare, right? Some for food. And you see that the packages are always labeled USAID, and not insignificantly, it always says, from the American people. In terms of foreign aid, the most generous country up to this point has been the United States. You can see by this chart. It's also interesting to see on a per capita basis, the most generous country has been Norway. The United States is about midway down the range. Of the aid that has been given historically, and these are U.S. government figures, the greatest amount of aid has gone to the state of Israel. But this year, early in the year, and we'll talk about that, the funding for USAID has been halted. It's currently in the courts to decide what to do. Protests are occurring not only in the United States, but abroad among those who give aid and certainly those who are recipients of aid. And it's important to understand that up to this point, 95% of the aid that is provided in the world is given by governments, right? And only 5% by private donors, NGOs and others. Now, as we look at this, it's important to understand that this figure of foreign aid is likely, as we're going to anticipate the future, is likely to diminish significantly. Certainly, whatever the U.S. does will have a huge hole, but our European partners, looking at the future, are likely to spend less on aid because they're spending more on military events as NATO comes under question, right? So this puts more of a burden upon NGOs or other organizations. Some of these are going to be well known to you: CARE, Oxfam International, Doctors Without Borders, Catholic Relief Services, International Rescue Committee. And as you're looking at this, the question is, well, if this is all global, what about local? So now I want to very quickly make the transition into local issues. Everyone has to ask, what is important to me? And what can I do? What can we do? What can my government do? What can other governments do? But what about the local? There's just two quick examples I want to use. One of these, and it's primarily for those of you who are students, is that you might be interested to know that the University of Montana is number 5 in terms of numbers of students who have been participants in the Peace Corps for our size of university. I mean, there's reason in my mind to be proud of that. So if that has any appeal to you, there are people on campus who can talk to you about it. And finally, there's a question of soft landing. Soft landing that, and we're going to be talking about that, deals with bringing the global to the local and having assistance and response. And it means that it's not only around this table, but it's in this particular valley where we live. Right? And I hope this sets the stage for you then about a discussion about international aid. Thank you very much.
Bit of a height difference here. Thank you. That's the way. Wonderful. Just a couple quick words. Thank you, Paul, for that wonderful lecture. We're going to move into the Q&A portion of the evening. So I'll welcome up our panelists to join us in front of the room. I'm going to welcome Dr. Rose Zuliger as our moderator tonight. Rose is a Missoula-based malaria expert who spent the last decade working with the U.S. President's Malaria Initiative with CDC and USAID. Please welcome panelists and Rose. Oh. Sorry, that was kind of rough. Oh, that's great.
Wonderful. Thanks for that, and thanks for sticking with us. Oh, okay.
I'll sit on the end.
you're-
Yeah. Let's
We'll do some musical. We
flip
plan
around.
this out seamlessly. Well, thanks so much for that wonderful kind of kicking off and laying the foundation for tonight's conversation. Before we get going, I do want to just ask our panelists to go ahead and just briefly introduce ourselves so that way everyone knows who's up here. While the panel is doing that, if you have a card in front of you that you have already filled out because you have so many questions and you're so excited, go ahead and pass it to the edges. And so we'll use some of your questions. I have a couple of my own, and we'll get the conversation flowing. So over to you.
I think I've got a mic
yeah, you're
on,
good.
so we're good to go. I'm Chris Hislop. First, I just want to say thank you very much, Dr. Lauren, for that excellent opening remarks. I think that sets the stage really well, and thanks to Soft Landing for the invitation. I worked in international affairs and humanitarian work for 30 years. I've been living here in Missoula now for 5 years, and the work I do now is humanitarian support projects in Gaza, in Syria, and Sudan. So my background and what I hope to bring to tonight's conversation is about the kind of the humanitarian world. And also, Dr. Lauren really set the stage well for thinking about the future. The things that are happening today. We're talking about those, but what does that mean for potential paths for us as a community, for our state, for our nation, and for our globe?
Hello, everybody. My name is Janvier, and I'm a former refugee from Uganda who moved here in Missoula in fall of 2018, who has been living in Missoula. I came with my family, and I was also part of the Soft Landing refugee that was welcomed in Missoula, and it's been a really amazing journey that I'm really happy to be here with everybody tonight.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa Bauer. Up until earlier this month, I worked for USAID. I was a senior transition advisor at the Office of Transition Initiatives. I've worked overseas for about 20 years. I've been with USAID 12 of the last 15. And my work was specifically focused on working in countries that were undergoing major transitions. So countries that were coming out of a massive conflict or war, where they were trying to figure out what a peace agreement would look like and needed help. Countries that were at risk of falling into conflict, particularly with the threat of violent extremism, as well as countries that were facing major governance challenges, whether it was a massive set of protests demanding democracy and human rights in countries such as in Burma, or countries that were at risk of democratic backsliding, where we were helping people in those communities, local organizations, private sector, civil society, really tackle these challenges because they know what works best in their community. And from the US government side, the more stable and democratic countries are, the better their trade partners for the US, and the better, the safer America is. And so my work in particular focused a lot on Central and West Africa and Latin and South America in the last few years, with a particular focus on those most marginalized groups, particularly women and children and other ethnic minorities.
So quite a panel, as you guys can see, and who knew that democratic backsliding would be so pertinent for our local conversation as well. But we'll kick it off and just ask, Janvier, if you can speak a little bit to your experience of international aid, how it influenced your life, when you were living in Uganda, and how it's continued to influence your life here.
Yeah, me growing up, I was born and raised in Uganda. my family came from the Congo in 1998. They didn't come because they wanted to go to Uganda. It was just because of the civil wars that was happening in the Congo. And speaking of experience, when it comes to international aid, I don't think of anything else but food. That's the only thing that comes to mind because that's what I grew up seeing being displayed everywhere in the country that I grew up in. So international aid is something that has helped millions of refugees in different countries, but tonight I'll be speaking specifically about Uganda because that's where my personal experience comes from. As a former refugee, it wasn't really easy. What international aid helped is these are the people who are being taken from their homeland to different countries seeking for a better life, and it's not as easy as might sound like, but it's just like these are people with kids. They don't know what to do. They don't know what to expect in these countries. They're just going there, hoping for a better life in their future. And it happens to be my family. But I would say being born in refugee camp, I had nothing else but refugee camp life experience. With the international aid, it's something that has been a big thing in my life because it's what I grew up on. There was so many things that I can name one. If I want to name one by one, we could go all night long. But speaking to that, there was so many different sort of organization and help that was coming through internationally and local. So the international aid is something that they help the new people in the country with the following: food, shelter, and ways of surviving, water, clothing. And growing up, I just grew up with all these things. I didn't know what international aid was until coming to Missoula, which is kind of shocking. But speaking to that, it's just because I knew that everything was being provided by the Uganda government, but growing up more and learning more about it, which it wasn't. International aid changes a lot of people's life due to these changes because people don't have no shelter. These are the people who are coming from different countries through the refugee program that for better resettlement in their life. My family was one of them, and it really provided food, clothes, schooling. These are the things that you don't really think of. They are coming from globally until you just, dig into it more. And also, it's just because it's not because of I didn't have any other life experience but just refugee camp. A lot of people might be like, how is it like being in refugee camp? It's not as easy. It's being like behind the world, which means that there is not much of a development as globally. There is no much of resources or opportunities to provide for families and to develop as a person. It had its own goods and bads. The goods is that it has provided and have saved millions of people's life, providing, and also as it kept going on, because there was so many, I would say Uganda is one of the countries that holds the most refugees in Africa due to the people seeking for better life and peace in their life. So going into that, it has really become into a big debate or argument, whichever way you want to call it. But most people, when they think of international aid, it's something that really, I was really amazed by Paul's conversation he just gave us here, that seeing how it has, helped and the changes it's making globally. But I don't know if you guys focused on, but one of the pictures that were displayed on the TV, on the screen here, the one that was USAID was food. I don't know if y'all realized that, but there was a flag of Uganda.
Yeah, I saw that.
So simply meaning that I only grew up thinking of international aid as food, which was the proof that it's correct. But also, it's just like really, there is so more into it if you think about it. It also kind of became into as a business more because, it's not that people are going into refugee status because they want to, or they don't have any other choice. These are the people who are hoping for their country to free and be peaceful so they can go back. But it's really sad, also happy because the people who are being born in refugee camp, they don't know anything else. My family was from the Congo, but I have never stepped a foot in my life in the Congo. So.
No, that's great. Thanks for sharing the importance of aid in your family's life, especially when you were in Uganda. Is there anything about international aid as a family that's moving from a refugee camp abroad? What is the role of international aid if they're settling here in Missoula, for example?
Very good question. Well, there's a lot you can, talk about when it comes to that, because it's giving people more hopes for their better life coming in the future. Because you are running away from, you are trying to, seeking for peace and to better yourself as a person. And also it helps people to develop them and create a lot of opportunities for people globally, because coming from Uganda, I didn't know that I was ever going to be sitting in front of these amazing people in front of me. And also it just helps you to develop you as a person, and there's helping you in the country you get into. You don't really know much of the country, and there is all sort of organization that helps you providing food, clothing, schooling, all the above, and to help you settle into the country, and that's part of the USAID.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing that.
Thank you.
So we heard a little bit about the importance of aid and the different roles that it's played and a wonderful history of aid. And I think we all are aware that it looks a little bit different right now, though. So Lisa, can you talk to us a little bit about what has happened in the past couple of months and what's USAID looking like now?
Sure. And actually, a question for the room. How many people heard about USAID for the first time this year? Okay. Yeah. There's a lot of people that were like, didn't know that was an agency in the federal government, and now it's gone, so what do I need to know? So USAID, I think all people who work for the federal government are used to changes in the presidency, right? When a new president comes into the US, there are going to be expectations that some programs wrap up, some programs are ramped up, depending on what the president is prioritizing. I've worked under 3 different presidents before, under Obama, Biden, and under Trump, the first term. And we were very prepared for what Project 2025 said and what America First said in terms of these are going to be the priorities, because they were pretty clearly spelled out with what was expected of USAID. It was going to be a slimmed down international portfolio. We were going to focus more on humanitarian assistance and life-saving aid and on global health, and a lot less on most other things. What happened in January was not what they had articulated the plan to be, and I want to be very clear with that. What happened in January was a pretty concerted and rapid effort to dismantle USAID as quickly as possible by the executive branch. Now, the executive branch actually does not have any authority to dismantle an independent agency of the federal government. That's the responsibility of Congress, but that was the plan nonetheless. And Congress has really only been on the sidelines of the whole conversation about the future of aid. So within very few days of the president taking office, there was an announcement that all international aid around the world, including military aid and aid from the State Department, was frozen. That included life-saving aid, food aid in refugee camps, global health aid to prevent the spread of Ebola, to deal with malaria, to deal with tuberculosis and a lot of critical issues, as well as work in conflict areas where USAID was providing support to prevent the spread of extremism. All of that was halted immediately. In addition, the government also froze all funding to American companies, organizations, faith-based organizations, including for work that they had done in 2024 under the last administration, and said, we're not going to pay this either. What that meant is that American companies and organizations, as well as thousands of organizations around the world, had to lay off all of their staff immediately because they had no way to keep people on staff, and there was no expectation of when funding might be resumed. So what that meant is that you had an entire industry kind of shut down immediately. And that was followed really quickly by layoffs, right? Rose was one of the first casualties, unfortunately, because global health staff were laid off almost immediately after all of this began. What then followed was, I would say, weeks of kind of constant changes in the government. As somebody who was supposed to be working on programs and suddenly I had no programs, there was no clear guidance on what was happening. So we were kicked out of the USAID systems. The USAID website went down. They shut the USAID offices in Washington. They took our signs down. But they never really communicated to us with what was happening. It was very, very unclear. Then on February 2nd, Elon Musk went on Twitter and called USAID a criminal organization and said USAID must die. That was then followed by a lot of rhetoric and questioning about what USAID actually did. And for people who didn't know what USAID did, it was really easy to believe a lot of what they were saying and to kind of generate a lot of support for what was happening. We've always had bipartisan support from Congress, but that was also gone. And so even though there was a series of lawsuits that followed in February and March, and judges ruled in favor of American organizations and American staff and said you have to reinstate USAID staff, you have to resume programming, and most importantly, you have to pay people for work they already did. The administration responded by terminating almost all of USAID's programs around the world. So I was then fired around that time as well, as were most of my colleagues. But then they were somewhat rehired and then fired again, and now it's really unclear who's working or not. In the meantime, a lot of our colleagues overseas are still stuck overseas because they shut all of our funding systems down, so there's actually no way to bring people home. And these are people who have kids in schools and pets, and it's not just easy to come home, but the White House threatened to unleash the military on them to force them to come home if they didn't come. So it's been difficult. Where are we now as USAID? So 86% of USAID programs have now been terminated. There's not necessarily any rhyme or reason to what's been terminated, right? So they said that waivers were granted for life-saving aid, but because a lot of those organizations haven't been paid for months and are owed millions of dollars, and it's unclear what they're being paid to do now, a lot of that aid hasn't restarted, or it's restarted in drips and drabs, which means critical health aid and food aid is not being delivered. There's food rotting in ports. Farmers that in the United States that have historically provided the food to go overseas haven't been paid for that as well. And so it's just quite a bit of chaos that still is continuing to go on. The last thing I'll say is that there is a new plan for USAID. And I don't want to diminish the work that a lot of my colleagues in Washington are still doing to fight to keep USAID as an independent organization. But I think the reality is that USAID is gone, that they have dismantled it so effectively that there is not going to be an international presence anymore devoted to helping people overseas. There is a plan under the State Department to subsume parts of USAID and to pick them back up under the State Department. But who's going to run them, how that looks, how they'll be funded, and what the priorities are very, very unclear. So that's where we are.
Everybody feel really uplifted now?
Yeah.
You knew you were coming to like a pick-me-up chat, right? Thanks for laying that all out there for us. Kind of with that in mind, can you just talk a little bit about what that impact is looking like domestically here in the United States, but also international, of the dismantling that you've described?
Yes. So domestically, the latest estimates, there are 19,000 Americans confirmed to have lost their jobs, but that's just confirmed. They're estimating that it's somewhere between 50 and 60,000 so far. These are Americans either working in the US or working overseas for the government or for American companies. I have a fair number of friends whose companies are at risk of bankruptcy because of this. They've also estimated 166,000 confirmed people overseas who are losing their jobs, but that is not really capturing the massive scale of chaos this has created in countries around the world. USAID worked in 100 plus countries, and we have just abruptly canceled our commitments to all 100 of those countries. And that is creating mass chaos, both economically for people as well as for aid, which has done real damage to our reputation as a country, as well as created this vacuum that China and Russia, Iran, and others are very happily filling. And so it has created this kind of space where some of the people that we are not historically allied with as a country have now taken over and rebuilt those relationships that we've walked away from. Domestically, in addition to unemployment, I mentioned farmers, but there are 3 farms in Montana that are specifically providing food aid. They're mostly in the Great Falls area. They were providing yellow split peas and lentils. And so again, the US government has cut most food aid, which means that Montana farmers are also affected directly by this. Montana State also had a direct agreement with USAID with their Livestock Innovation Lab that's been canceled. That was specifically looking at livestock practices around the world. So it's had quite a bit of an impact domestically. And I think the broader issue with this, and we can talk about this more, is if USAID is not going to be investing in these countries, and right now it's unclear what our actual strategy is. As Dr. Lauren said, there's fewer organizations globally picking it up, but because nobody's even sure what USAID's funding anymore, it's unclear what people are going to pick up. Europe has already scaled back its support. But there's also just, this is already killing people, right? It is going to create a lot of devastation and destruction around the world. If we stop this support to people, it is going to increase poverty and famine. And if we increase poverty and famine, we increase the spread of diseases, we increase conflict, which leads to more migration, and all of these things cumulatively are going to make America a lot less safe. And I am I'm really a bucket of fun tonight, so.
I will say, if you work in international development, you should come talk to Lisa and I. It used to be a fun group of people doing international development here based in Missoula. We'd get together and have a nice time. We haven't been super fun lately, but we have grand aspirations for the future. So maybe kind of carrying on that same trajectory, we heard a little bit from Lisa what that impact is looking like now. And I think, Chris, you spoke to the fact that, in particular, you're looking forward. And so can you think and kind of share with us what these changes in the U.S. role that the U.S. is having in terms of foreign assistance, what does that mean for the future of international development? What's that mean for the future of the United States and its position within the world?
Yeah, these are the big questions, aren't they? Thanks. I'll take those.
We're just warming up here.
I'm happy to talk about those things because I think the question to lay it bare for most Americans is, why is my money going over there instead of here? I mean, this tends to be the base question. It's not the only question, and it is a dramatic oversimplification of what we're talking about here, but it's often on people's minds, no matter where you live or what political persuasion you are. When the question of America's role in the world, be it international aid, be it military aid or otherwise, we are constantly, and rightly, as Dr. Lauren said, a very legitimate question. We need to ask this question: why are we doing this? Why is my tax money? Because everything we're talking about, if you're working and paying tax, it's your money. And that's why in USAID it says from the American people. It's not from the government, it's not from the president, it's from the people, it's from you. It's your tax dollars that propel this. And what you are propelling in that is an investment. And so this is kind of where I want to pick up on looking into the future a little bit, drawing a little bit from my experience in different places around the world in humanitarian affairs and other, is if you zoom out a ways and you try to, I really appreciate, Paul, what you said about this is about people, because there's a reason why it's called humanitarian aid. It's about people. This is about humans. But when you zoom out a little bit, trying to keep a focus on humans, you know that what we're in is a market. We're in a market of values. There's a global market of lots of things. There's cars and materials and this and that, but there's also a global market in values. And that is an extremely active market. And everybody is playing in that market. Everybody, nations, regions, organizations, everybody is vying in the market of values, because in the market of values, you have influence. You begin to gain or lose influence in the ways in which the world operates. So the United States made a huge investment in the market post-World War II in standing up the United Nations. That wasn't just largesse or altruism. That was a very keen and intelligent investment in America's place in the world and America's future place in that world. It wasn't just because of the here and now. We were propelled through the events of World War II and the Holocaust and the Cold War and the atomic age. But it was also a look into the future, saying all of these things we need to begin to invest so that the United States can maintain its role and its influence in the world. And so when Dr. Lauren talked about motivation, like what motivated the United States to start doing this? It's interesting that those motivations, although the world has changed considerably, and there's a lot of changes from what happened in 1948 and earlier to today, some things remain the same. And we've touched on those things, but that investment and that market is about prosperity, it's about stability, and it's about influence. And if you're in that market, these are the things that you're vying for, and these are the things that are being considered and traded. So for example, when America is engaged in the world, when USAID is out there providing, let's say, malaria support, for example. I mean, Rose is an expert on that. They're out in countries and in villages and in places delivering something real and serious to people that they see and receive an immediate benefit. And that benefit then begins to play into their understanding of the values in which is propelling this stuff. It's not just thanks for the jab. It's not just thanks for the bag of rice. It's, wow, there's something. How many times have you all, when we're overseas, been asked, what are you doing here? Why aren't you back in the United States? You should be there. You're in this terrible spot. And, well, it's part of our values. It's part of what we do. That's interesting. Okay, now I'm not saying that by doing this, you turn everybody into free market capitalists or, free trade. That's not my point. My point is we share a number of values as a society. And those values are reflected in the way in which we engage the world. And not only are they reflected, but they're traded, they're taken, or they're rejected because they're competing. I mean, a good example of that I'll tell you is, actually, Jean-Vier, this is from Uganda. I was in northeastern Uganda, this is like 15 years ago. I'm driving out through the bush, like in the middle of nowhere, I swear. And we're on this bumpy little dirt road, and all of a sudden, right at the line of the internal state inside Uganda, there was a huge asphalt road. And right next to it was a bunch of Chinese workers on heavy machinery because the Chinese were investing in the infrastructure of Uganda. They were paying for roads, bridges, airports, and this kind of stuff, right? Now, we can all debate whether that's good or bad or what have you, but that is an engagement of their values in Uganda, and Ugandans are seeing this and like, well, that's kind of nice to have a good road because now it's cheaper for me to bring my goods to market, and I can make a greater profit. Now I can pay for my kid to go to school. That's not bad. That's in action, and this is what's happening all over the world. And if people prosper, if things are stable, then they begin to say, the values that you're purporting to in this international engagement, I kind of like that. That kind of suits me. And people are more open then to the kind of engagement that the United States has historically in the world. This is what we've tried to offer the world. Again, it's not out of pure altruism. We have a self-interest in this, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But I just note that if you look into the future of the global market of values, a significant retraction from the marketplace. I mean, just imagine any marketplace. Come on, if you have something that you're trying to sell in a shop and all of a sudden you take it off the shelves, what do you expect? You're not going to sell anything. No one's buying it. You're going to forget about it. And your competitor, as you said, the vacuum, Aristotle's nature abhors a vacuum. This is real, that, of course, not just Chinese, Russians, and Iranians. Many people are streaming into this vacuum where America once was, exerting influence for our interests, for the interests of others, and now they're in the market and we're out of the market. So I guess the point is to look into the future if you can imagine this, is it's a place where suddenly you were not only were you in the market, you, the United States, but you were shaping the market. The market was actually made by us. The global international order and the trade was hugely shaped by American hands. If you step out of that, you're out. You're not influencing. You're not suggesting, and now the market is open for other values and other products and other goods. It's the nature of the thing. And so that to me is, maybe something to really think about. Where there's a lot of possibilities of what the future might hold in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. But there is no future out there of the things that we enjoy, the benefits we enjoy as a society, and the engagement and influence we have in the world if we're not there. You can't have it. It won't work.
So just kind of unpacking that a little bit further, the global market, the global kind of international influence that the United States has had, we've stepped away and have left this vacuum. Do you think there's a scenario in which we come back? And does it look the same? Can it look the same?
Well, the question is this pendular effect, right? We all wonder about this. And American history shows that this is not uncommon. It's not just a 4-year cycle, but there are larger ups and downs in the ways in which Americans imagine ourselves and imagine our place in the world. And so it is natural and normal to have change like this. Well, no, it's natural and normal to have change like this. Maybe not so. I mean, natural change occurs over time. It's not typically abrupt. So, look, the short answer for me is yes, of course. The United States still remains the preponderant power, be that culturally, economically, militarily. We still maintain this role. But one does not rest on one's laurels. Americans love to say this. We know this. We're like, don't just sit there. You got to keep it up. You got to keep going. This is part of our kind of the way we think and part of our values. And so the longer you stay out of the market, the longer you stay disengaged, the easier it is for other products and other values and other ways to come in. And let me, just so I'm not hitting the panic button too hard here, not all other values are bad. Okay, I'm not saying that America has the only good value in the market. There's lots of values, lots of interesting things that people can, take in and accept and use, right? It doesn't simply mean that all of a sudden everything is Chinese or everything is Russian. No, that's not the point. The point is simply that things are going to come in, and then the re-entry into the market, it's always harder. I mean, any of you who are business people or who are in a market of anything would understand the dynamic. I take my stuff out, I'm out for a while, now I try to get back in. Whoa, that's a heavy lift. I mean, it really is. And so it's going to be very difficult to re-enter just by the very nature, I think, of a market.
And maybe just to share an example, I was on a call yesterday in the kind of global malaria coordination space about vector control, which is kind of dealing with mosquitoes. We don't like mosquitoes in the malaria space. And we were talking about when the United States, USAID, would typically pay for a bed net to keep mosquitoes from biting, in particular young children at night. Usually we pay upon delivery in country. They've now invested, the company has manufactured this, they've put it on a ship, it's a year later, they get paid. We were talking, do we think manufacturers will allow that anymore? And the answer was, well, would you want to send a product to if somebody came to your shop and they didn't pay you the last time, you had to take them to court last time in order to get paid back, would you go ahead and say, yeah, I'll front you, I trust you, or would you demand payment before you hand over anything? And I think that kind of shows some of the longer term implications of trust and that kind of the relationships that has been really integral to U.S. influence over time. So just to kind of make things
Can I pick up on that, Rose? Just one last comment on this, which is to say, you know, that there's been a lot of talk, there's always been, this is not new, but it's kind of come to the fore about efficiency. You've got this Department of Government efficiency, and people are talking about efficiency. You know, we've always thought about this, but, you know, there is economic and private sector efficiency, and that's good at certain things, but it's not good at all things. And to suppose that the ways of the private sector will simply take care of or fill the market space. Like I said, the USAID leaves the market space. What comes in? China, Russia, but also there is this, I think, hope by many that, oh, the private sector will come in and it will be more efficiently delivering these things that formerly were handled by government bureaucrats and so on. Okay, look, there's probably some things that could do that, but not all things. And so I want to just put into this marketplace that government exists for certain purposes and does certain things extremely well, doesn't do certain things extremely well. But when it comes to aid and the human dimension of aid, not the economic, you know, cost-benefit analysis of aid, government and the international system do quite well.
Thanks for that. So you've referenced efficiency and some of the things that have come out. We've all seen critiques, I think, in the past couple of months of international assistance. So, for example, there's been reference to waste through the alleged provision of condoms in Gaza. Lisa, is there validity in these critiques? Are there some truth or kind of relevance of these critiques? Where is it coming from, and what does it mean?
I think there have always been critiques about international aid, and I think U.S. citizens have every right to question how our tax dollars are being spent. And I know that within USAID space, everybody I know has a lot of opinions on how we could do it better, right? And there are some valid criticisms. I think within international aid, we've come a long way in how we think about things in terms of inclusion and ownership in countries, sustainability, handing things over, corruption. So there's a lot of lessons there. These specific allegations, I think, it's a difficult conversation because the allegations came out in a way that then all public access to records about USAID disappeared, and so it made it very difficult to talk about them, right? So I'll give a couple of examples, and I won't give too much space to some of the actual accusations because they're slightly crazy. But for example, I mean, we talk about condoms for Gaza, condoms for Hamas, right? And that was a huge shocking point. There was also a lot of condoms for the Taliban, and how dare USAID do these things? You can look, there were two different websites that existed publicly that anybody could access around the world, usaspending.gov and the Development Experience Clearinghouse.gov. And those are both public websites that publish how USAID spends all of their money. And all of our contractors and partners were required to upload regular reports of what they were actually doing. And sometimes we'd scrub information if it was like super sensitive in an area where there's a lot of violent extremism, for example, to protect our partners. But all that information was publicly available. So you had the ability to look at what was being, you know, lobbied against USAID and say that's actually not accurate. This was all scrubbed. So condoms for Hamas, condoms for Gaza, it's actually condoms for Gaza province in Mozambique, right? Which Rose verified with me because that was what I've been told, but is actually the case, right? Same. That was for healthcare, right? To reduce the spread of HIV/AIDS, for family planning, being able to give people in Mozambique access to information to make their own determinations about healthcare. Same with Afghanistan. When we talk about condoms for the Taliban, these are health centers run by Afghani doctors, nurses, that may have family planning elements to them that were, again, taken over by the Taliban. But those ideas were taken and then they were run with, and because USAID staff were fired so quickly and the accusations were coming from within the government, it's actually really hard to refute them. And so I think it's really important to understand that a lot of what was pulled out there is elements of, oh, actually, let's dig into this a little bit more. And maybe some of these activities actually were about diversity and inclusion, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they were about what people said that they were about.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to jump in on that about some of the critiques of USAID? If not, we've got some wonderful questions from you. We also have a mic here, so if you either have such a long question that you felt like you couldn't write it down, or perhaps you didn't end up getting a card, please feel free to come on up. But we'll go ahead and get started. What are the prospects for the courts to override some of these decisions, like closing USAID, since Congress authorizes funding, not executive orders? I feel like, Lisa, you might want
Yeah.
to answer that one.
Yeah,
Let's hand it to
yeah, and
Lisa.
I am curious what you think too, Rose. So, the courts have been ruling almost consistently in the favor, they have consistently ruled against the Trump administration in terms of USAID. The rulings at the end of February said that what was done to dismantle USAID was unconstitutional because this is not actually the responsibility of Congress. I think if we're being very honest with ourselves, the fact that Congress has been so quiet, not everybody in Congress, there have been some pretty incredible senators and representatives who've gone to fight for USAID and haven't given that fight up. But Congress is quiet for a reason, and looking at the breakdown of who is in Congress right now, if the courts continue to say that the administration did this wrong, the Senate will eventually dismantle USAID, right? And so it will restore people's jobs temporarily. It will pay our contractors temporarily. It isn't going to bring back USAID. If we had done this in a different way, and there were plenty of ways that the administration could have done this in a way that was respectful of other countries and the people doing the work overseas, this would have been a conversation, people would have been notified, and they would have gradually let people go and gradually terminated contracts. That probably would have saved taxpayers money, frankly, at the end of the day. But I don't see a world in which USAID continues to exist because there's not the support in Congress that existed up until earlier this year.
Yeah, and I might just add, I think building on Lisa's point, what the court orders have been able to do are, one, show how illegal the actions have been to date, which is why we're seeing across, political parties, across divide, a recognition that this is not in allowance with how our government is structured. That being said, there are legal ways to end a program. There are legal ways to fire people. There are legal ways for many of these same actions to have occurred. But to Lisa's point, that's not how this was done, which is why the government is going to be spending a lot of money in legal defense of their illegal actions. The end result will be the same. I talk all day, every day with lots of different advocates. Very few of us are talking about saving USAID. We are talking about saving the programs. We're talking about making sure that those most critical humans that our government has employed here in the United States and abroad, that make sure that aid is delivered effectively, that it truly is saving lives, that it truly is aligned with American values, however you might see those. That is that's our priority now. So we are seeing through court actions some temporary relief. It is not going to be resolved through the courts. Instead, we are fighting to have our Congress, for example, make sure that those most critical pieces of our work continue, although it will not look the same.
And if I could just add one point, because I forgot to mention it earlier. The ways in which the contracts were terminated, the 86%, the 5,000 programs that have been terminated, was mostly done through DOGE using AI. So there wasn't, what the initial intention was a strategic review, which is pretty normal, where people would present what the different programs are and there'd be a conversation about what gets cut and what's not. What they essentially did was look for keywords like gender and women and diversity and transition, which took my whole office out since transition is literally our office name. And that's how they made the first cut. There was no real ability to have a conversation. And so even this week when the Senate was asking the State Department, Why did you cut maternal health? Why did you cut tuberculosis? Why did you cut counterterrorism programming and programming directly countering China? The State Department's response this week was, we don't know, we'll look into it. So it's not really thoughtful. So what Rose says about trying to save programs is what it's all hands on deck right now doing.
So here's a question for Dr. Lauren. How are international aid and democracy linked? You had said it just makes sense to support democratic governments. Is there an argument to be made for that, which is not reduced to a moral argument of people's rights to govern themselves? And how does it help the United States to have healthy democracy spread? And how does that link with international aid? So someone did actually manage to fit a lot of words on a card. So you
Will you
can
grab
do
that
it,
for me so I can see
but
it?
I'll pass it over to you as well.
Give me just a moment to read all this. Right? Now, this is the question is basically, does it make sense to have democratic governments? And is that in America's interest? And I'd say, in general, that's true. And if you say, wait a minute, what do you mean in general? There have been recent elections that, how to put this, have put democracy in peril. Elections. One's pretty close at home. But I'm reminded that there was an election years ago that elected Hamas in Gaza. And I'm sure that people have buyer's remorse at the moment for that. But people make mistakes. People, we assume, and I think it's a good place to start, that people are going to make rational decisions. And if you teach at a university, it's based on a certain measure of rationality. That is, we all do things for a particular reason. Capitalism is based on the idea that people are going to vote on their self-interest. And I think in general, that's true. But the interesting part of this question is there some hazard with that? I think the hazard is this. I'm convinced that not everyone always is rational. It doesn't give me any pleasure to say that. I think there are times that decisions are made out of sheer ignorance. I think it's made out of indifference. And recent events would lead me to believe that some decisions are made out of deliberate malice. Yes. And that's the nature of asking people to vote. Right? One other point it has to do with, I can't help myself about the efficiency question, right? But it does have to do with democracy. If there is, and I love the way you phrased this, Chris, about an economic efficiency makes a certain amount of sense in that realm. But you just can't transfer a lock, stock, and barrel to government. And that is, if you look at the writings of the founders of America, the word efficiency never shows up. Democratic governments are not efficient, right? Indeed, the Constitution is designed, you could say, to deliberately create inefficiency by checks and balances. I mean, we've talked about the judiciary, we've talked about the executive branch, and we've talked about the legislative branch. And so, just historically, at least in the 20th century, one of the classic signs of leaders who are bent on autocracy is that you claim that you can be more efficient because people respond. Instinctively, you say, yeah, that's a good idea. Or corruption. Oh, yeah, if it's corruption, we want to root out corruption. Those are two dangerous expressions to use if you're talking about maintaining democracy. And I think it behooves us to go back to the rationality issue. It behooves us to be rational and look at this and have, in the title of tonight's lecture session, a critical conversation, and be critical about exactly what seems to be occurring. The other question, just since I'm talking about democracy, it has to do with what do you think the forecast is going to be about the courts, right? And we're speculating, and it's always dangerous for a historian to speculate. But it would seem to me that we don't know the future. I think in general it's not particularly bright in terms of somehow bringing us back to where we were. I have some real hope in terms of the lower courts. I wish I could say the same about the Supreme Court, and I never thought I'd live to say that. The immunity decision is so broad and so sweeping, I'm really worried about what that might mean in this particular case. Also, the second point I would make about the court system is that we're talking about, the question had to do with cases before the courts having to do with USAID. The administration is flooding the courts with a wide variety across the board. U.S. Institute of Peace, I mean, Department of Education, if those of you who follow the news know, if you just flood the system, right? The idea of expecting a quick or a really meaningful decision, it seems to me, is somewhere down the road.
No, thanks for those points.
Yeah. So now you can have your question.
The souvenirs. And so I just want to turn a little bit. We've talked about kind of some of you in the room very understandably hadn't heard of USAID before tonight. And so I want to just ask you, Jean-Pierre, what do you wish or what do you think it's important for kind of the average American to know about international aid? What are some of those key messages that people just probably haven't heard?
Well, there is a lot that ways that I can answer that question, but the truth is that it's not that everything that what you see being displayed on the news or on the TVs is actually what's happening. To that is that we have gotten to a point that where that whoever gives you aid controls you in today's world, where that these are not, it's in the system where now they're not giving aid to help people anymore. They're giving aid to benefit their own wills and wealth in that way that people who are such as in people who are in power of managing this aid, what is supposed to be delivered to the locals or to the people that are in need of it, they don't get it the way that they're supposed to due to the poor management of the people in power.
No, thanks for that. And it made me think of a question that Lisa and I talked about earlier, which is you talked about aid is helping in many ways Americans. So Lisa, can you talk about in what ways did the United States historically and hopefully again in the future benefit from aid?
Yeah, and I think it's an important question, especially when we look at what does it mean to put America first, right? And you can say that maybe not all aid is created equal, and some aid is more important for security than other parts of aid. I think when we talk about the world, I would ask everyone to think about what COVID-19 was like, right? You heard that something was happening in China, and then like 4 minutes later, you were fighting over toilet paper in the grocery store, right? So many of the world's problems today are global. And so what USAID did was help keep those problems local to specific parts of the world to prevent them from reaching all the way to the United States, right? So much of what Rose and her colleagues have done is not just about responding to an urgent Ebola crisis, but was about helping countries build stronger health infrastructure that allowed them to detect and address infectious diseases and other issues before they could spread, right? It also helped the United States have a presence in places to be able to determine what was coming and to be able to help people address it. And so if we look at moving away from doing international aid, what we're risking is the health of Americans, because so much of what USAID did was the ability to prevent massive things from reaching the United States. There was a study in 2022 from the World Bank that said for every $1 of surveillance and prevention in the health sector, it actually led to at least $10 in savings for emergency health response. And so the idea was Americans actually benefit quite a bit from the work that USAID was doing to protect, and to kind of diminish the spread of disease in different countries. Similarly, so much of what USAID was focused on was about making it so that people didn't want to leave their homes. I think Americans often have this idea that everybody's trying to come here, and people do want to come to the United States. But a lot of times people would much rather stay home if they could, right? If it was safer for them. And so a lot of USAID's work, again, I spent a lot of time in Guatemala the last few years. It was specifically helping the Guatemala government address the main reasons that people were migrating to the US, right? There were huge issues with corruption. The indigenous groups in parts of the country had no access to resources and no voice in government, and gender-based violence was super high. And if the government of Guatemala can tackle those issues, people were much less likely to migrate. And so there are a lot of different ways that Americans benefit indirectly from aid that we don't even think about, right? But we will feel their absence when they're gone.
Thanks for that. I have some more cards here. This is your chance to come up to the mic if you'd like to, or if you have a card that hasn't been collected. Please, come on up.
Is it okay if I speak loud?
It's okay for me, but maybe not for the MCAT recording. Are we fine?
I just wanted to follow up on that point that, what you're talking about is still a long time horizon for the benefit to reach us. And when you talk about a market of values, sorry to start. When you express this as a market of values, that's a long play. You're building trust over time that people will say, let's do it the way they do it up there in the States. But now we're entering, if we watch the people on the text chain that was leaked to the entire world, people were sitting there with a calculator figuring out how much it cost us to bomb Yemen because they wanted to present a bill tomorrow to our European allies. So the short-term orientation, the transactional orientation that marks our current way of thinking just doesn't allow us to do anything that the benefit is long-term. So I just wanted to add that, and thank you.
Thanks. It seems we've now approached the Oprah Winfrey part of, while I'm up, would anyone else like to have the mic for a question?
Perhaps this question may be impossible, as the very nature of it's often questioned. However, as Plato, or perhaps even Socrates, said very famously in the Republic, how are you to persuade someone if they refuse to listen? Now, this is obviously a very pertinent problem, not only globally, but in particular in the American democratic process around specifically USAID. Now, indeed, I preference that this might be an impossible question. However, how might one go about this? How might you address this? For it does seem to be the core problem from my perception of how all this came about.
So you're specifically, how can we influence what might transpire moving forward? Is that right?
I suppose so, yes.
Okay, great, thank you. Does anyone, Chris, I think you win.
Thanks. Yes, an impossible question, but why not? Let's maybe other people have other views. I'm happy to share mine. So good question. Thank you. I'm reminded actually of where I am right now at the University of Montana and this extraordinary Mansfield Center, which benefits not just our university and our community, but is engaged in the very important work of civil dialogue. So how do you influence somebody who won't listen? We're suffering this ill in American society. We all know it. And by the way, we're all part of it. I'm going off script here on the international aid thing. I'm kind of taking a slight turn. But anyway, it does relate. I will somehow even if I fake it, I'll make it back to international aid. But right now, I will just say that this idea of the only way to make people listen is to engage them honestly and openly and critically. I think amongst the many ails, there are the many ways in people have chopped up what's going on here in America, is an extraordinary a propensity to assume that my extraordinary logic will overwhelm yours. Mm-hmm. I have extraordinary data and facts and logic, and I will completely overwhelm you with it. And if you don't agree with me, you're stupid. It kind of, I boil it down, but there's a lot of that going on from all around the place. I don't have to agree with somebody to try to understand them and try to engage them and try to work together towards a shared end, which we have here in the United States. We have a shared goal. We have a shared country. We may not agree, but it does not limit the possibility of having a civil dialogue. All that said, we know where most of this is like, well, it's not my problem. It's actually the other side's problem, right? I'm civil. I'm good, but they are not. Believe me, everybody says that, from all sides. So I think the only way you get people to listen, is in true and genuine dialogue and engagement. But I will say, as Lisa pointed out, if we're being critical, what happened in USAID, it was not a conversation. It was not a critical review of something. It was a stamping out of something. And interestingly, this hasn't come up yet, but Paul, you kind of mentioned it, but if you look at the total U.S. federal budget, of course, the amount spent on international aid is minuscule compared to the overall budget. Somebody probably has that number in their head, but for USAID, it's less than 1%. Yeah. For overall international aid, USAID, State Department, and others, it's a very minuscule amount. So the efficiency gained by that action is relative to the total inefficiency is unbelievably small. Like, it begs the question, like, okay, why'd you start there? But anyway, I digress. I think my answer would be, the usual answer, which is, we're not going to get through this thing by simply saying, I have an overwhelming logic. And I'm tending to hear a lot of that from all sides.
Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to jump in. The other point that I've been playing around in my mind with a lot is, the conversation often goes to this money should be invested in America instead. And that's a real conversation to be had with people, and not in a confrontational way. But even if you say, okay, some elements of international aid actually make us safer and stronger, and we'll still fund those, but the rest of it should go to America, I think there's a real question about where that money should be going, right? Like, how should we be making America stronger? Because a lot of what USAID's doing overseas, the government is also doing here, and nonprofits and other organizations are doing work here. Teacher trainings, funding access in rural schools, investing in science, investing in research, healthcare, clean water, all these other things. But those are also being cut in America right now as well. And so I think there really is value in having that conversation amongst each other, not trying to make it a fight, but to say, okay, if that money isn't going to go overseas, what does that actually mean for us here too? Because we're not seeing that money be invested in Americans either.
Did you want to jump in?
No.
Okay. No, thanks for attempting to answer the unanswerable. So hopefully that will suffice there. I might just kind of pick up on one of your points, Chris, because it ties into, there's a lot of different questions here. I'm only going to attempt to tackle one. It says, can any of you explain the impact of our Stopping USAID has shown? Lisa spoke a little bit to that, but there's a question, how many deaths by malaria? And so I just want to give a concrete example. So Chris spoke about the fact that, for USAID, we're talking about, about less than 1% of the global budget. A much smaller fraction of that goes to global malaria work. And yet that translated into 37% of global malaria funding came from the US government. That's a lot. And that means that on January 20th or thereabouts, when that funding stopped, the impact was catastrophic. 1,000 extra deaths a day because of that, just of malaria. Now, some of that funding has come back, right? And so it's not as dire today. But that funding was turned off to the tune of about 40,000 extra deaths just from malaria. So I think that gives you a sense of not only the scale of what we've been doing in the United States, as the United States, in terms of making the world safer, making the world healthier, but also how catastrophic and actually inhumane the way we went turning off that aid really was. So that sounded depressing, because it is. So I'm going to pick us up a notch for our penultimate question here is, someone says, and I'm no names, I grew up down the street from the UN and trick-or-treating for UNICEF at Halloween. I actually, when I read this, thought of, how many of you had a Halloween bag that actually says like trick-or-treating for Halloween for UNICEF? That's how I read this. It's only as I'm reading it aloud I realized that I can't relate to this person. I thought that I could. But apparently I can relate to many of you in the audience who similarly have a UNICEF Halloween bag. So question for you, Dr. Lauren. Can you just talk a little bit about what's happening with the UN and those global structures, and any hope that there might be, any implications that this is having for the UN, and kind of hope for a revival?
Yeah, the broader question is the role of the UN. The organizations that were created after the Second World War still exist. Coming back to a point that I made earlier about these are public funds and they're public debates, all of which strike me as entirely appropriate. American administrations vary about the level of support for these various humanitarian organizations. And sometimes it's a dramatic swing. Sometimes there's a lot of rhetoric and not too much swing, but the U.S. still continues to support them, at least to some particular level. So much attention has been spent on American institutions and not the UN at the moment, but there's no question in my mind that they're going to very quickly come under, I'd like to use the word scrutiny, but given the role that AI plays, they're going to come under attack. Right? I mean, there's an organization at the University of Montana that just lost several $1 million because of an AI quote search, and there was no discussion about the merits one way or the other. And I think that this is very likely to happen at the UN. I think that the challenge, there are a couple, would be that how is America going to respond in general, and how America responds in part is going to be up to Congress once the Constitution is reaffirmed. But also, these organizations depend very, very heavily upon private money. I mean, we all get appeals for assistance with the World Food Program, UNICEF, refugee organization. If you give to one, you're going to get more appeals from others. We've all experienced that at the mailbox. That's going to increase because people are going to feel compelled, look, we have to provide the services. The other challenge is going to be from other governments, and that is to come back to Chris's point about values. One of the things that the United States has done, and I'm proud to say, has really set an example, right? And has said these are important matters to us. And if the United States clearly and explicitly, unequivocally pulls out, that question of credibility and honesty and values suddenly is diminished. Sometimes it's going to collapse. And if people say, look, the US doesn't support this, there's no reason for me to support it. I think that's a distinct possibility. But not to leave you on an entirely negative note, I can also imagine other countries saying, you know what, we're going to step up to the plate. I mean, I gave you the example, for example, on that bar chart about Norway, right? Just incredibly generous, right? And they may, having spent a lot of time in Norway myself, I can imagine them saying, you know what, now's the time to step up to the plate. And I also can imagine many of my fellow Americans and many people who live in this valley with me saying, you know what, I'm going to increase my contribution to UNICEF, right, to the refugees. And so I think that that's a distinct possibility as well. Whether it's sufficient to cover what government funds have been is another question. But again, and I can't help saying this as a historian, there were lessons learned as a result of 2 world wars. And you would have thought that those lessons would have stuck. And they've stuck for 80 years. And we're at a period of dramatic change.
Can I add something there to what Paul said? I'll try to keep this brief, but on the historical note, it's a really interesting note that when you reference Henri Dunant, the person who created the Red Cross, it's known as the modern era of humanitarianism. The story, what happened to him, he's a businessman, and he came across a battlefield, the Battle of Solferino in 1859, I think it was, and he saw a sea of human suffering. And so what he actually did the next day is he pitched a tent on the battlefield because there were people dying and laying out in the sun, and it was a horrible scene. And he tacked a sign on the tent, and it was not the Red Cross. It said, "Tutti fratelli." And for the Italian speakers there, we are all brothers. It was the kind of elucidation of this point of we're actually all in this together, everybody. We're all here now. All those guys who are dying from all sides, their uniform doesn't matter anymore. We're all in this together. And that thought came through the Red Cross and came through humanitarianism and comes through today in this very point here. This idea that I or we can go it alone. I'll tell you, there's lots of issues I can be soft on, like, well, we can consider this or consider that. I'll tell you this, that is dead. That idea that a country can exist and be completely apart from everybody else is not real. It cannot happen. And if it does, like anything now that goes it alone, I'm sorry, you are going to suffer. Countries, people, whatever. And so I think just to kind of bring that into the discussion about others stepping into the breach, others coming in, yeah, I hope so too, because I think it is part of our human nature to come into these places where we see people need help, just like Henri Dunant did in 1859, just like good people are doing this very day right now all around the world.
That's a perfect segue to our final question is, what can we all do, right? We're sitting here, we're concerned citizens, we care. It'd be helpful to hear from everyone on the panel, what are different ways that you think that someone sitting here can help? What does that look like? Do you want to get us started, Lisa?
Sure. I think one of the biggest things is we know life is getting tough already for a lot of Americans, right? And I think one of the best things we can do in the face of everything that's going on is to take care of each other. There's a lot of incredible organizations in Missoula, like Soft Landing, that are working within our community to help people. And I think that's really incredible. There's a lot of really great organizing going on with different organizations in Missoula tackling these issues as well and talking to each other about how we can come together as a community, including organizations like Missoula Resist, that are really important avenues for people to talk about how to build a broader sense of community and support each other. So I think that's one way. The other is, in recognizing everybody has to do what works for them, knowing that things are going to get tough, is anybody who's interested in helping, right, and helping people outside of Missoula. There are so many great organizations around the world who are doing incredible work, who've lost a lot of funding. I'm on the board for an organization in Nepal that works with women specifically on menstrual health and hygiene, and we're trying to identify even opportunities in Nepal. Particularly the LGBTQI+ community has lost a lot of funding, women's health, a lot of these areas, climate change. So anything that interests you, you're welcome to talk to any of us about, different organizations that we think are great. But there's a lot of information out there about great organizations who have lost funding that even a little bit could go a long way in helping them stay afloat. And so I would say if you prioritize supporting organizations here, but there's a lot of work out there that is incredible that could use help.
So finding the cause and committing time or resources in support of
Exactly.
it. Can you add anything on to that?
Yeah, I'll respond to that, and it's an echo, Lisa, of what you've said. Eleanor Roosevelt, who worked to really craft this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, after spending a great deal of her time working for the rights of women, civil rights in America at a time when it was not popular, was asked exactly this question. And they said, you know, Mrs. Roosevelt, you're famous. You've been able to do all these things from the White House, do these things from Geneva, New York, at the UN. I'm just a lowly person, and I want to do something, but I just, what can I do? I mean, I'm not famous like you. And she looked at him and said, I'll tell you, human rights begins at home. If you want to make a difference, you want to work at your local school, you want to work in your neighborhood, you want to work in the valley and where you live. And it's going to be defined in different ways. The last thing you want to do is to throw up your hands and say, you know what, there's nothing I can do, right? And in Missoula itself, I mean, you just think of whether it's at Soft Landing, the food bank, Pavarello, I mean, there's a long list. And looking out here, I know a number of you are involved in exactly these programs. Eleanor Roosevelt would say, good for you. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Wonderful. What's your suggestion?
Well, you know, there is a lot of times when we want to help, it's just that we feel like we don't have what it takes to help others. But really, that's not true, because speaking as somebody who grew up in a refugee camp, a lot of, you know, there is a lot of ways that you can help, and you don't necessarily need to be helping in a huge number amount. You just, you know, even the things that you think that not going to help, it can easily change somebody's life, you know, such as it doesn't have to be, you know, money or anything. There is so many great organizations out there that you can find that you can look out in the public and help out with, and that help that it might not be delivered to the way you want it to be, but somewhere, somehow, that help that you sent out is going to help somebody. It might not be somebody you know or you're going to ever know, but it's going to change somebody's life some way, somehow. Because somebody say that it's not about how much you give to help, it's about how willingly you're giving to help.
Wonderful. Thanks for that. Do you want to round us out?
Yeah, I'll just, you know, what, all of these things up here are so true. I'm relatively new to Missoula, but it doesn't take long to see that this is a community full of people who are living and activating their beliefs and values. It is a norm in our community. I don't say that as a pat on the back. I say it as somebody who's kind of new and like notices this and appreciates it. And I'm glad, because it was something that I was looking for. And so I don't, you know, I'm not going to simply, you know, echo what others said, which is spot on. I will try, however, to offer something that maybe you don't do, or maybe might be more of a challenge for you. And I hope it is. I think on this question, all of these things are true. Here's some homework. Go and talk to somebody who does not agree with you on this matter. Maybe some of you do, maybe you know some people, or, you know, I don't know, you know, whatever. But one of the dynamics that is afoot here when you talk about international aid or America or America's place in the world is that, again, I possess a superior logic and it is better than yours, and you know, why are we even talking, and all of this thing. Go and talk to somebody. In fact, don't talk, just listen. Just hear somebody out and see what they have to say. It is incredibly interesting. I do this on occasion, maybe not as much as I should, but it is very, very good for me. And I hope it's good for our community, our society, and our nation, and our world. Because, you know, we're just not all going to agree on stuff all the time. We know that. We're adults. It just doesn't happen. But, you know, we need to still be in the game, still engaged, still talking, still discussing. But not just with ourselves. Not just with ourselves. With others who do not think like us. Not to have to change the mind. I'm not going to try to, you know, it's this way. No, it doesn't always have to end that way. A civil engagement can have a lot of fruit outside of changing somebody's mind. There, that's you're in the university, you get that homework tonight. There you go.
Wonderful. So, oh, I see a hand, but do you want to be our very last person to speak? Very last, please. Yes, contact your elected officials,
Hear, hear.
absolutely. So,
Almost last. Rose, tell us about April 5th.
oh, well, Carrie told me to do it. So if Carrie said, I'm just, along the line of making yourself heard, there are a series of national events that have been happening. Some of you are tracking them, some of you are already a part of them, or are very much a part of leading them. The next national event is happening on April 5th, which is going to be Hands Off. Similar to many, I think it's over 600 events across the country. Missoula at the courthouse at noon on April 5th will be having those who are having, concerns with all the different ways in which the administration or our legislature is not necessarily reflecting what we understand as American values will be coming together. So it was a forced plug, but thank you, Carrie, for that. And I just really also want to conclude by thanking you all for coming out here. Obviously, Soft Landing does such integral work that I think really closely aligns with a lot of the values. It's a wonderful opportunity to kind of dig in supporting local causes. Really want to thank them for putting on this event. Or is there anyone else we should? Thank you, obviously, to the university and all the different partnerships that were a part of this. And I think we're looking forward to continuing this conversation with all of you. So thanks for coming.
Thank you.